Padda is a video essayist that I've found on YouTube some months back, and I like his content. I really did. He only has such a few videos on his channel, but the few that I saw I thought was very insightful. Here we come September 2025, and I think that he really missed the mark on this one. So he just recently made a video about the murder of Iryna Zarutska that happened in August, and we just started getting more information on it about a week ago. And I don't really like the way he approached the topic. I think that there's just so much we all can learn from the coverage he did on this video. And this is coming from somebody that's a fan of his work. I just don't like to see people misrepresent things in a light that can be harmful. So let's get into it.
Today, I would like to address the tragedy that has not received nearly enough media attention, the brutal murder of Iryna Zarutska. Here are the facts that many outlets have shamefully and intentionally failed to report. On August 22nd, Iryna Zarutska was stabbed to death on the rail system in Charlotte, North Carolina by a savage career criminal. This beautiful, innocent 23-year-old young woman was a Ukrainian refugee who had recently fled her country for a chance at a safer life.
New surveillance footage shows the moments leading up to and following a senseless, random attack. He then attacked her from behind for no reason.
This really should have been a national story. A young refugee who fled a war zone for safety was killed on a public train. But if you look at mainstream outlets, especially left-leaning ones, the coverage has been almost silent.
This is just false. If you look up all of the websites that they showed in the video, you can see that within 2 to 3 days, they all posted about this story. Iryna was killed on August 22nd, and the video footage did not become public until September 6th. Between September 6th and September 9th, all of these news outlets did say something about what happened. And already we're starting off with a false narrative that left-leaning news sites aren't trying to cover this story when in fact they did. And as any story is, when it first comes out, it doesn't get as much traction until the days following. So to pretend that video footage that got released and 2 days later, there's articles written about it that is supposed to be the same amount of exposure as maybe the week upcoming behind it is just absurd.
And people have noticed. Where the story has blown up is on X, but the reaction there has taken a darker turn. The tragedy has been turned into fuel for actual racism. People are generalizing, stereotyping, and spreading hate. And to be clear, that is objectively wrong. There is no justification for it. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The racism isn't happening because of Iryna's murder itself. It's happening because the pendulum has swung so far in one direction over the last few years that people are now swinging it back just as hard the other way. The selective coverage of tragedies, amplifying some and ignoring others, has created a climate of distrust.
I agree, Padda. They are amplifying some and ignoring others. How about Dr. Talib Jihan Khan, a doctor who was stabbed to death at a picnic table outside of her home back in 2023? Many of us don't recall this, do we? Or Nia Wilson, an 18-year-old who was randomly killed in San Francisco back in 2018. Any big uproar about that? Or just last month where a man slashed another woman's throat in Tulsa, Oklahoma on a bus. We're not going to sit here and act like there's this picking and choosing of what murders get highlighted by the news and in the way they are highlighted. When random acts of violence happen, there is no story to it. We can't sit here and pretend like all stories are the same. And yes, they're all tragic and they're all sad and nobody condones any of it. But when there is a clear right and wrong in the story, that's when stories do not get as much coverage.
And when people lose trust in institutions, they don't move towards balance. They move toward the margins. This is the pattern that we're seeing over and over, and to understand it we have to look at other recent cases. Take George Floyd in 2020. His death dominated global headlines. The protests, the media coverage, the political attention, it became one of the most defining cultural events of the last decade. Compare that with Iryna. Both were tragedies. Both were acts of violence that deserve serious reflection, but only one was amplified into a worldwide movement.
This is where I'm actually probably going to lose my shit doing this video. Two things being a tragedy does not automatically make them equal types of tragedies. George Floyd being killed by a police officer that was doing far too much than his job called for subduing an unarmed man that was on the ground telling you that he could not breathe while continuing to press your knee onto his neck and killing him is far different than a random schizophrenic man that kills a woman on the train. Are they both tragedies? Yes, but there is a higher bar of expectation for how the police is supposed to be public servants for the people that they are policing and a random person that nobody has any control over on the train. Again, this isn't to say that what happened to her isn't tragic and shouldn't be talked about, but to act like it's the same type of story as what happened to George Floyd is honestly disingenuous as it gets. Because with that logic, every single murder that happens in America every single day should get worldwide coverage because there is an awful taking of a life.
And the other? Barely even mentioned. Or look at Daniel Penny and Jordan Neely in 2023. That case was everywhere. The media turned it into a national flashpoint. Endless debates about race, self-defense, vigilantism, and inequality, but the nuance often got lost. Many people treated it as the same as a deliberate murder, when in reality it was a chaotic moment that ended tragically. It's clear that the framing mattered more than the facts. And this is exactly how the pendulum works. One tragedy gets turned into a global cause, another gets buried. One gets stripped of context and blown up into moral theater. Another gets ignored because it doesn't fit the preferred narrative. And when people notice these double standards, it pushes them further to extremes.
I love how in your own distinction of the Daniel Penny case versus the Iryna Zarutska case, you literally pointed out all the things that made it unique and why it was worldwide coverage and discussed the way it was. Vigilantism, mental health, self-defense, all of these things are the reasons that case was discussed so heavily. There was no clear-cut idea of who was right and who was wrong in that situation. There was plenty of people that thought Daniel Penny was right, and there were plenty of people that thought Jordan Neely didn't deserve that type of treatment. But at the end of the day, you answered it on your own. There was no clear-cut idea in this situation of who was the aggressor and who was the victim. And to even say that it was stripped of nuance is just honestly antithetical to the point that you're trying to make itself. You named all these different types of problems and world discussed views of things that you just ignored all of that to just pretend like it's the same treatment as Iryna. There was a victim and an assailant, and the assailant was wrong 100%. There's no discussion. There's no debate. There's nothing to discuss further than he is going to jail for life, possibly to death.
And here is where I believe a lot of the blame actually lies, with legacy media. Because when you look at these cases side by side, it's not the tragedies themselves that stand out, it's the way they are framed, or in some cases, ignored entirely. Just think about it. When a young white man like Daniel Penny defends himself and others in a chaotic situation, the media explodes with coverage.
Well, thanks for saying the quiet part out loud. To automatically assume that people just know that Daniel Penny was defending himself when Jordan Neely was never accused of hurting anybody physically, just being a nuisance on the train. Yeah, you just told your bias, sir.
Headlines paint him as a villain, a vigilante, a symbol of systemic oppression. The story is amplified for weeks, sometimes months. Whether you even agreed with that framing or not, you couldn't escape it. But when someone like Iryna Zarutska is deliberately and viciously murdered on public transport, the silence is deafening.
I'm not trying to sound like a broken record, but again, there is no story behind a heinous random act of violence. Iryna was unfortunately a victim to that, and there's not a big story behind it. There's no discussion to be had that's long lasting beyond it happening in and of itself, and condolences and support for her and her family. But other than that, there's no discussion to be had unless you want to have one about mental health.
No headlines, no mentions, no global protests. And that silence speaks volumes. Because what it tells people is that some stories matter and others don't. Some lives are worth amplifying where others can be quietly forgotten. And when that's the message being sent, it's no wonder people lose trust, and it's no wonder people turn to extremes. This is why I say legacy media is at the root of this pendulum swing. Because their selective coverage fuels the backlash. When you demonize someone in a self-defense case, but ignore a clear act of brutal murder, you both shape public opinion and you deliberately polarize the nation.
So let's just address the elephant in the room at this point. Kyle Rittenhouse. We're just going to sit here and pretend like that wasn't the biggest cases known to man in modern history, where a young white male managed to shoot 3 people in the middle of the street and get off on self-defense. I mean, like, come on, what are we talking about right now? Kyle Rittenhouse was one of the biggest cases, and of course, everybody was invested in it because, once again, there was a story behind what happened. Maybe to people that don't really understand self-defense, they thought it was more to this simply because Kyle Rittenhouse was at a BLM riot/protest. That's why people really wasn't sure of what should happen. And there was a lot of confusion about who he shot at first, which was ridiculous. That means people don't care to look into things. But nonetheless, he shot people and got off on self-defense. And everybody was invested because there was controversy. There was a talk of self-defense. There was a talk about racism. There was a talk about mental health again. And there was talk about police brutality. All of that makes a conversation, which is why people were invested in it. And it involved no black people directly. So let's not pretend that this is about trying to make black people look innocent and white people look bad all the time. Clearly, that's not the case. It's always about what's actually a story and what people care to talk about in the public discourse.
And once again, the result is the same. Extremism on one side breeds extremism on the other, and the middle ground collapses. When one side exaggerates or ignores, the other side doesn't just try to correct it, they swing even harder. And when the first side reacts again, the cycle keeps going. Each swing makes the other worse. And the middle, the place of balance, nuance, and actual genuine conversation gets smaller and smaller. This is why we're now seeing a rise in genuine racism, especially online. It's not that people are reacting directly to Iryna's case. They're reacting to years of feeling like the system has been dishonest, selective, and manipulative. And instead of finding truth, they're running straight into the arms of extremism. But the silence is also deafening on the other side. No one that has a voice seems to be calling out the racism, because it's also not fitting their current narrative. Even platforms that claim to be neutral aren't trusted anymore. Take Wikipedia. Almost immediately after Iryna's murder, people noticed how the page was being handled. It's very obvious that the language was softened. The brutality was downplayed, and edits were filtered so certain details couldn't be added.
This is what happens when you don't use critical thinking skills and you just want to push out a narrative. If you want to look at this objectively and not just look at it through a lens of this is a story I can capitalize on, obviously you're not going to put certain words in a Wikipedia article that are legal terms prior to there being a court case. Murder is a legal term. That is exactly why George Floyd's page says that Derek Chauvin murdered him. DeCarlos has not gone through any court proceedings yet. Therefore, the legal term of murder cannot be used on the Wikipedia page, even though we all see the footage of him stabbing her, which is why they specifically use the word stab and not murder. Everything isn't a conspiracy. Everything isn't just to sell some type of story. Everything isn't just DEI. Everything isn't racism. I truly don't understand the concept of people thinking that everybody has some ulterior motive with the things that they do versus just maybe taking a step back and looking at the bigger picture of what's happening. People clearly forget that murder is a legal term more so than just a factual statement. It's a legal term before anything else.
And honestly, none of this surprised anyone, because at this point, no one really trusts Wikipedia, and everyone knows it's curated by people with their own political leanings.
Yes, obviously people that do work on Wikipedia pages do have political leanings, but that does not inherently mean that everything that gets posted by these individuals on Wikipedia is going to show their political leanings. I'm not saying Wikipedia should be your end-all be-all as a resource for information, but it is generally a good starting point to just understand basic facts of something that's going on. That's just true.
But that's exactly the problem. A site that was supposed to be the internet's encyclopedia is now just seen as another player in the culture war. So obviously, instead of being a source of shared truth, it's become another place where people expect narrative management. And this is where I want to be clear. Pointing out double standards in coverage isn't about justifying racism. It isn't about saying George Floyd doesn't matter or Jordan Neely didn't matter. Their lives mattered. Their deaths were tragedies. But so was Iryna's. And if we can't tell all these stories with the same level of honesty, then we're just feeding the cycle. Selective outrage on one side creates selective outrage on the other. Silence on one story becomes ammunition for extremism on the other. Consistency matters, because without it, people stop trusting not just the media, but each other as well. And once that trust is gone, every tragedy just becomes a tool in the culture war. That's the danger we're in now. And here's the sad part. At the center of all of this, George Floyd, Jordan Neely, Iryna Zarutska are all real people. People who tragically lost their lives. And instead of being treated with honesty, their stories become tools in a never-ending culture war.
And that is where we will end this, where I agree and disagree with Padda. Yes, I do think all of these stories are tragedies, and they're all worthy of us giving our hearts and prayers, and they're all worthy of being spoken on, but they are not all the same as far as what a news media cycle should look like, or it does look like. In a perfect world, every single murder that happened every day on this earth in this country would be highlighted, but realistically, pragmatically, practically, logistically, I don't think that's possible. But nonetheless, that does not mean all of these people's lives are more or less valuable than the other. And we shouldn't look at it that way. If you're going to be objective and do video essays and commentary on these situations without trying to sell yourself as pushing a certain ideology, which I'm not accusing Padda of doing, because I'm not 100% certain of what his goals are as a content creator, but just being honest, this is not about a narrative. This is just understanding how news cycles work. It is about a story. It's not about lives being lost inherently. And how you feel about that is going to be different from person to person, and I'm not here to tell you you're right or wrong about either one, but just be honest in your telling of this type of situations. But I appreciate y'all, man, and if you made it to this point in the video, make sure you leave a like, comment, sub. If not one, then all three, and I'm gonna catch y'all in the next one. Peace.